Hi guys, there is a certain kind of quiet that belongs to the past. Not silence exactly, but a steady kind of sound that never changes much. In ancient Egypt, that quiet was shaped by a river. A long river that moved slowly through dry land, as if it had always known where it was going. The Nile did not rush. It did not surprise anyone. It arrived, it receded, and it returned again, like a breath that never forgot its rhythm. And because of this river, life became something very steady. Not easy. Not always kind. But steady. People woke up knowing what the land would do. They did not guess. They did not wait for change. They simply lived inside a pattern that had already been decided long before they were born. The sun rose over the same horizon each day. It warmed the same fields. It touched the same stone walls and mud brick homes. And as it moved across the sky, it pulled shadows slowly behind it, like time itself was walking gently through the villages. In these villages, most days looked almost identical from the outside. A person might wake before the heat grew too strong. The air in the morning was soft and slightly cool, carrying the smell of dust and damp soil from the riverbanks. Some homes were small, built from mud brick that dried under the sun. The walls held the warmth from the day before. At night they released it slowly, like they remembered everything that had happened during the day. Inside, families moved without hurry. There was no need for urgency, because the day itself was already understood. Water had to be fetched. Bread had to be prepared. Fields had to be checked. Animals needed attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not as events. But as quiet routines that repeated themselves until they became part of a person's memory, like breathing. The Nile was the reason for all of this. Each year, it rose in a slow and predictable flood. It did not arrive suddenly. It came with time, spreading gently over the land, leaving behind dark soil that felt rich and alive. This soil was what made farming possible. And farming was what made everything else stable. So the people learned to wait for the river. They learned its timing, its moods, its patience. Even children grew up knowing that life was not scattered or random. It was arranged by water. During the flood season, fields disappeared under shallow water. Villages looked different then, as if the land had softened and blurred at the edges. Boats moved where feet once walked. Reflections of palm trees trembled on the surface of the water. The world seemed briefly inverted, but still familiar. And then, slowly, the water would retreat. It always did. When it left, it revealed lines of dark, fertile earth. Fresh ground for planting. Fresh ground for repetition. Farmers returned to their fields almost without needing to think about it. Their movements were practiced, quiet, and steady. They scattered grain in familiar patterns. They guided simple tools through soil that had been softened by water and time. Nothing about it was rushed. Nothing about it was experimental. It was the same work, season after season, generation after generation. And because of that, life felt predictable. Not because it was simple, but because it was known. Even the weather followed a kind of rhythm. There was the hot season, when the land seemed still and heavy under the sun. There was the flood season, when water returned and changed everything slowly. And there was the growing season, when the fields turned green and steady again. These seasons did not surprise people. They were expected like chapters in a book that never changed its order. In this kind of world, people learned to think in cycles rather than sudden events. A year was not a collection of surprises. It was a loop. A return. A repetition that carried meaning simply because it always came back. Even time itself felt less like a line and more like a circle drawn in sand. Villages followed this rhythm closely. In the early morning, smoke from cooking fires rose slowly above rooftops. It drifted upward in thin streams, disappearing into the pale sky. Inside homes, bread was prepared from grain that had been stored carefully. The process was simple, but always necessary. Grinding grain, mixing dough, baking in small ovens made of clay and heat. The smell of bread was part of the daily atmosphere. Not something special. Something expected. Outside, animals moved through narrow paths between homes and fields. Goats, donkeys, and cattle followed their own quiet routines, guided by people who already knew where they needed to go. There was little confusion in these movements. Even animals seemed to understand the rhythm of the place. And beyond the villages, the desert waited. Still. Dry. Unchanging. A vast stretch of land that reminded everyone of limits. It did not support farming. It did not offer easy survival. It simply existed, like a boundary that could not be crossed without purpose. So people stayed near the river. They clustered where life was possible, where water shaped the land gently year after year. In this closeness, communities became stable. Families lived near each other for generations. Work was passed down slowly, without interruption. Skills were repeated until they became natural, almost automatic. A child would grow up watching the same tasks done in the same way. Water carried in jars. Bread baked in familiar ovens. Fields prepared in steady seasons. Nothing about it needed explanation. It was simply how things were. Even the larger structure of society reflected this sense of order. There were farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and officials. Each group had its place, and each place had its purpose. Not rigid in a harsh sense, but organized in a way that reduced uncertainty. A farmer did not need to wonder how to farm. A builder did not need to guess how to shape stone. A scribe did not need to invent writing each day. Everything had already been learned and repeated long before. And because of this, life felt predictable again. Not because nothing changed at all, but because change itself followed familiar patterns. Even the Nile, which seemed powerful and alive, was not chaotic to the people who lived beside it. They watched it carefully. They understood its signs. They remembered its behavior across years that stretched into memory. The river rose. The river fell. The land responded. And so the cycle continued. There is something calming in such repetition. A sense that the world does not need to be figured out each morning. A sense that much of life has already been arranged in advance. In ancient Egypt, this feeling was everywhere. In the sound of water moving through irrigation channels. In the slow steps of farmers walking behind animals. In the soft light of sunrise touching the same fields again and again. Even silence felt familiar. Not empty, but steady. As if the land itself was breathing at a slow and consistent pace. And as the day continued, that rhythm did not break. It simply shifted slightly from one task to another. From morning work to midday heat. From field to home. From sunlight to evening shade. Always moving. Always returning. Never rushing ahead. This was the foundation of Egyptian life. A world held together not by sudden events, but by repetition so consistent it became invisible. And in that repetition, people found something very simple. Not excitement. Not surprise. But a quiet sense that tomorrow would feel very much like today. And that was enough. The river would return. The fields would be ready. The work would continue. And life, in its calm predictability, would move forward again, gently, without hurry, into the next familiar day. In ancient Egypt, life often began and ended in the same places. A person was born inside a home built from earth. And many years later, they would return to the same earth in a different form. Between those two moments, life unfolded in a rhythm that felt steady, almost rehearsed. Homes were simple in structure, yet deeply familiar to those who lived inside them. Mud brick walls held the warmth of the sun during the day and released it slowly at night. Roofs were flat, often used for sleeping when the air became too warm inside. Inside, the space was not large, but it was used carefully. Every corner had a purpose. Every object had a place. There was little excess. Not because people lacked imagination, but because life itself did not require much variation. A cooking area. A sleeping area. A place for storage. That was enough. The sound inside these homes was usually soft. The gentle crackle of fire used for baking bread. The quiet movement of water being poured into jars. The low voices of family members speaking without urgency. Even conversation seemed to follow a slow rhythm. People did not rush words. They let them settle into silence between sentences. Outside, sunlight changed the mood of the home throughout the day. Morning light entered softly, angled and pale. Midday light made everything brighter, sometimes too bright, causing people to rest or slow their work. Evening light stretched long shadows across the floor, signaling that the day was beginning to close. Time was not measured only by tools or numbers. It was felt through light, heat, and the body's own sense of tiredness or energy. Families lived together in close, steady patterns. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents all sharing the same small world of daily repetition. Children learned by watching. There was little formal instruction in the way people often imagine today. Instead, knowledge passed through observation and repetition. A child would see bread being made many times before ever attempting it. They would watch water carried from the river again and again. They would learn the shape of work through memory rather than explanation. And because of this, life felt continuous. There was no clear separation between learning and living. Everything blended together into the same slow experience of growing up. Fathers often worked in the fields or in craft-based labor, depending on their role in society. Mothers managed homes, prepared food, and maintained the small systems that kept daily life stable. But these roles were not dramatic or distant from each other. They were interconnected, part of the same larger pattern of survival and routine. Even rest followed a predictable rhythm. After long hours under the sun, people would return to shaded spaces. They would sit, drink water, and let their bodies cool slowly. Rest was not considered separate from work. It was simply another part of the cycle. Night in ancient Egypt was quiet. Not silent in a total sense, but softened. The sounds of insects near the riverbanks. The distant movement of animals settling down. The occasional murmur of voices inside homes. Above it all, the sky stretched wide and steady. Stars appeared with a familiarity that people would have recognized across generations. They did not change quickly. They did not surprise. They returned each night, like old companions. Sleep came naturally in this environment. Not forced, not scheduled in a strict modern sense, but guided by exhaustion, darkness, and habit. And when people woke again, they often returned to the same sequence of actions. Water. Bread. work, rest, night. The repetition was not seen as limitation. It was seen as order. Even emotions tended to move within this structured environment. Joy was quiet. Sorrow was steady. Celebration, when it came, followed familiar forms and rituals. There was comfort in knowing how things unfolded. Uncertainty was not absent, of course. No society is entirely predictable in every detail. But the larger structure of life remained stable enough that unpredictability did not dominate daily thought. People did not wake each morning wondering what their world would become. They already knew the shape of the day. And this shaped how families related to one another. There was patience in the way generations lived together. Older members of the family carried memory. Younger members carried repetition forward. Stories were not told as rare or dramatic events. They were part of the slow continuity of life, repeated over time until they became familiar patterns themselves. A story about a flood. A story about a harvest. A story about a successful season or a difficult one. These stories did not disrupt life. They reinforced it. Even tools inside the home reflected the sense of consistency. Stone grinders used for grain. Simple pottery for water and storage. Woven baskets for carrying and organizing goods. Each object was shaped for repeated use. Nothing overly complex. Nothing designed for novelty. Just practical forms that worked the same way each day. The world outside the home supported this stability. Villages were built close to one another along the river. Not scattered randomly, but placed where water, soil, and access allowed life to continue easily. Paths between homes and fields became well-worn over time. Feet naturally followed the same routes until the ground itself seemed to remember movement. Even small changes in the environment were noticed carefully. A shift in the river's level. A change in the color of the soil. A slightly different pattern of wind across the fields. These changes mattered not because they disrupted life entirely, but because they fit into a system people were always observing. Life was predictable, but never ignored. People paid attention to its patterns with quiet focus. Children grew up with this awareness. They learned early that the world had structure. That it moved in cycles. That effort returned in familiar ways. There was no expectation of sudden transformation in everyday life. Instead, there was expectation of continuity. And continuity is a powerful form of stability. It does not demand attention the way change does. It simply continues. As the day passed in ancient Egypt, this sense of continuity remained present in everything. In the way people walked. In the way tools were used. In the way meals were prepared and shared. Even the heat of the afternoon, which might feel intense, was part of something known. It would pass. It always passed. And the evening would arrive in its place. Nothing needed to be questioned deeply. The structure of life had already answered most questions through repetition. What to do in the morning. What to expect from the river. When to rest. When to work. These were not mysteries. They were patterns. And so the world, in its steady rhythm, continued forward. Not fast. Not unpredictable. But gently consistent, like a long breath that never seemed to break. In ancient Egypt, work did not arrive as something separate from life. It was already inside it. It began quietly, often with the light of morning spreading across the river valley. Before the heat grew strong, people were already moving. Not quickly. Not with urgency. But with a steady understanding that the day had already been arranged in familiar steps. Most work was tied to the land. And the land, in turn, was tied to the Nile. This connection made labor feel less like a sudden demand and more like a repeating agreement between people and nature. Farmers would walk toward their fields along paths they had walked countless times before. The ground beneath their feet was familiar, worn down gently by years of passage. There was no need to think about direction. The body already remembered. Fields stretched out in quiet grids along the riverbanks. Some were small, shaped by family use. Others were larger, managed through shared effort or overseers who helped organize labor. The soil itself carried a certain weight after the flood season. Dark, rich, soft under simple tools. It was not dramatic to look at, but it was dependable. And in a world like this, dependability mattered more than anything else. Work began with preparation. Tools were gathered. Animals were guided into place. Simple wooden plows or digging instruments were checked and used in ways that had not changed much across generations. The movements were practiced, almost automatic. Not because people were bored, but because efficiency came from repetition. A farmer did not need to experiment each morning. The method was already known. Seeds were placed into soil in steady patterns. Not rushed. Not random. But measured in a way that matched the land's ability to receive them. Even the spacing of work followed a rhythm. A pause. A step. A placement. A movement forward. Again and again. The sun rose higher as the morning continued. Light grew stronger. Heat settled slowly into the air. Work adjusted naturally to this change. In the early hours, people moved more actively. By midday, movement slowed. Rest became necessary, not as luxury, but as part of survival. Shade was important. Simple shelters near fields provided space to sit, drink water, and wait for the harshest part of the day to pass. Conversation during these breaks was calm. People spoke about weather. About water levels. About small changes in the fields. There was no rush to discuss distant or unfamiliar things. Life was already full within its own boundaries. Animals played an important role in this steady system of labor. Oxen pulled plows through soil in slow, consistent motion. Donkeys carried goods along village paths. Goats moved between areas of scrub and farmland, grazing in controlled ways. These animals were not separate from daily life. They were part of its rhythm. Their movements were as predictable as human ones. Even their sounds blended into the background of the working day. The fields themselves changed slowly over time. After planting, there was a long period of waiting. Not idle waiting, but attentive waiting. Farmers watched the land as it responded to water and sun. Green shoots appeared gradually. Rows of plants became visible. Growth unfolded in a way that could be observed but not rushed. This slow development reinforced the sense that life followed natural patterns that could not be forced. Everything had its timing. Harvest season arrived when the plants had reached their quiet peak. Again, there was no surprise. The cycle had already been known from the beginning. Work during harvest was more intense, but still orderly. Groups of people moved through fields collecting crops in steady motion. Cutting. Gathering. Carrying. Each step followed the one before it, like a sequence that had been repeated many times in the past. Grain was separated, stored, and measured carefully. Nothing was wasted unnecessarily, because the system depended on balance. What was taken from the land needed to be managed with care so that the next cycle could begin again. Storage areas became important during this time. Granaries held grain in simple, protected spaces. These structures were not elaborate, but they were essential. Inside, grain was poured, measured, and kept for later use. This stored food represented security. It meant that even when fields were resting or flooded, life could continue without disruption. In this way, storage itself became part of the predictability of society. People did not wonder if there would be food tomorrow. They knew it had already been prepared for them in advance. Other forms of work existed beyond farming, but they followed similar patterns of repetition. Craftsmen shaped pottery using simple tools and steady hands. Stoneworkers carved materials slowly, with attention to form rather than speed. Weavers created cloth through repeated motion that could be maintained for long periods. Each craft relied on memory and repetition more than innovation. Skills were passed down through observation, practice, and time. A young worker would spend years simply watching before becoming fully capable. There was no expectation of rapid mastery. Only gradual understanding. Even trade followed predictable routes. Goods moved along established paths between villages and regions. Exchange was not chaotic or spontaneous. It followed known relationships and familiar agreements. People understood where things came from and where they were going. The river itself supported the system. It acted like a natural highway, guiding movement and connection. Boats traveled slowly along its surface, carrying goods, people, and messages. The water remained steady beneath them, reflecting sky and shoreline in soft, shifting images. Time on the river felt slightly different from time on land. Still predictable, but more fluid in appearance. Yet even here, patterns remained. Boats moved with the current. Stops occurred in familiar locations. Journeys repeated routes that had been used many times before. In this world of work, repetition was not seen as limitation. It was seen as reliability. People did not measure success by novelty or change. They measured it by continuation. Did the fields grow again this year? Did the grain return? Did the cycle hold? And most of the time, it did. That consistency shaped how people understood their lives. Work was not a disruption to life. It was life itself, unfolding in a steady and familiar pattern. And as the day moved forward, from morning light into afternoon heat and eventually toward evening calm, the rhythm of labor never truly broke. It only softened. Like everything else in ancient Egypt, it returned gently to its place within the cycle. In ancient Egypt, time did not feel like something that rushed forward. It felt more like something that returned. Each year, the Nile rose and fell in a pattern so steady that people came to trust it in the same way they trusted the rising of the sun. Not because it was gentle every moment, but because it was known. The river was never just water moving through land. It was a cycle that shaped everything. When it began to rise, it did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost quietly at first. Fields near the edges of the river would begin to change. The soil would darken. The air would feel slightly different, heavier with moisture. People noticed these changes not with surprise, but with recognition. It was happening again. The familiar return of water. As the river continued to rise, it spread across the land in wide, shallow layers. Villages near the floodplain adjusted their movements naturally. Some paths disappeared underwater. Some areas became soft and reflective, like mirrors laid across the earth. Life adapted without panic. Boats replaced walking in certain places. Work paused in fields that were temporarily underwater. Daily routines shifted, but did not break. Everything simply moved into a different phase of the same cycle. There was no feeling that the world had changed into something unfamiliar. It was still the same world, just in a different condition. People had learned this rhythm over generations. It was not written in a single moment. It was remembered through long experience. Parents taught children not through formal lessons, but through repeated observation. When the river rises, we wait. When it retreats, we plant. When it settles, we harvest. These patterns were not questioned. They were lived. Even the idea of time itself became tied to the river. A year was not measured only by numbers or marks. It was understood through stages of water. The rising, the covering, the retreating, the return of soil. This cycle became a natural calendar, embedded in memory and daily life. Because of this, people did not experience time as unpredictable movement. They experienced it as repetition with variation. Each year was similar, but not identical. The flood might be slightly stronger or slightly weaker. The harvest might be a little more or a little less abundant. But the structure remained. And structure brings calm. Even in years when the river behaved differently, people did not abandon their understanding of its rhythm. They adjusted, but within the same framework. It was like listening to a familiar song played at a slightly different pace. The melody remained recognizable. This sense of predictable time shaped how people thought about their lives. There was less urgency about the unknown future. Because the future was expected to resemble the past. Not exactly the same, but close enough to be trusted. Even death was understood within this rhythm. Life was seen as part of a larger cycle that extended beyond individual experience. People came and went, but the land and river continued. This created a quiet sense of continuity. Not necessarily comfort in a dramatic sense, but familiarity. The river kept moving. The fields kept returning. The cycle kept unfolding. And so life felt contained within something larger and steady. During the flood season, when the river covered much of the land, villages took on a different atmosphere. Movement slowed. Work in fields paused. People spent more time inside homes or on raised ground. The world felt temporarily softened. Edges between land and water blurred. Reflections became more visible. The sky appeared closer to the ground through water surfaces. In this quiet time, certain tasks continued indoors. Repairing tools. Weaving cloth. Preparing stored goods. Telling stories that passed time gently. These activities did not feel like interruption. They felt like another layer of the same cycle. Even rest had its place in this structure of time. People slept more during certain parts of the year when outdoor labor was reduced. They adjusted their bodies to the rhythm of the land without needing clocks or schedules. Light and heat guided everything. Morning light signaled beginning. Midday heat signaled pause. Evening shadow signaled rest. The sun itself became a kind of slow clock moving across the sky each day in a predictable arc. And because this pattern never truly changed, it became invisible. People did not think about it constantly. They simply lived inside it. The Nile's retreat was just as important as its rise. As waters slowly pulled back from the land, they left behind dark, fertile soil. This moment was always quiet. Almost like the river was stepping away gently, without force. What it left behind was what made life possible. Fields were prepared again. Soil was worked again. Seeds were placed again. And the cycle began once more. This return of land was not seen as a separate event from the flood. It was part of the same continuous process. Rise. Cover. Retreat. Renewal. Again and again. Over time, this repetition shaped not only agriculture, but thought itself. People began to expect continuity in most things. Change did not feel absent, but it felt structured. Even seasons beyond a flood followed a recognizable order. Heat, growth, harvest, rest. Each phase flowed into the next without sharp interruption. In such an environment, unpredictability was not absent from life, but it was contained. It existed within boundaries that were already understood. And so society became naturally stable. Not because nothing ever changed, but because change itself followed familiar paths. As the river moved through its endless cycle, people moved with it. Not resisting, not rushing ahead, but adjusting quietly to its rhythm. And in this shared movement between water, land, and human life, there was a deep sense of predictability. A feeling that the world, in its own way, already knew what it was doing. And it would continue doing it again. In ancient Egypt, society did not feel like a scattered collection of separate lives. It felt more like a carefully arranged pattern, where each part had a place, and each place had a purpose that rarely needed to change. Not rigid in a harsh or sudden way, but steady, familiar, expected. People grew up inside this structure the same way they grew up beside the river. Slowly, naturally, without needing to question it every day. At the center of this structure was a sense of order that reached into nearly every part of life. Fields, homes, work, and storage all connected through a larger system of organization. And above local villages, there were people whose work was to maintain that system. They were not distant in the way modern imagination might assume. They were simply part of the same predictable world, performing roles that helped everything remain stable. Some of these people were scribes. Scribes held an important place because they worked with writing, measurement, and record keeping. But their work was not chaotic or constantly changing. It was repetitive in its own way. They recorded grain. They recorded labor. They recorded deliveries from fields and storage places. Lines of marks on surfaces made from papyrus or stone reflected the steady movement of goods and work. Writing itself was not seen as something mysterious. It was a tool. A consistent way of preserving what was already known. Scribes learned slowly, often over many years. They practiced the same symbols repeatedly until they became natural. Their work required patience more than speed. And because of that, their lives reflected the same calm repetition as everyone else's. Above scribes and local administrators were officials who helped manage larger regions. Their role was not to create constant change, but to maintain balance. They ensured that fields were properly worked, that grain was collected and stored, and that resources moved where they were needed. This system depended on repetition and predictability. If one part of the cycle failed, others adjusted around it. But the goal was always the same: to keep the pattern intact. Even leadership itself, in the broader sense, was understood as part of this ongoing structure. At the top of society stood the pharaoh. But even this role, in the daily understanding of most people, was not experienced as something distant or unpredictable. The pharaoh was seen as part of the natural order of the world. Like the river, like the sun, like the cycle of seasons. Not always visible in daily life, but understood as constant. The idea was not that one person controlled everything in a sudden way. It was that stability flowed through the system from top to bottom, like water moving through carefully shaped channels. The land itself depended on this sense of order. Irrigation systems were organized to guide water across fields in controlled ways. Canals and channels were maintained to direct the flow of the Nile's flood waters. This was not done randomly. It followed patterns that had been tested and repeated over time. People understood where water would go because it had gone there before. This predictability made planning possible. If water arrives here, then fields can be placed there. If the flood reaches this level, then planting follows that timing. It was a system built not on surprise, but on expectation. Even taxation, which might sound strict in a modern sense, followed this rhythm. It was tied to harvests and agricultural cycles. When the land produced grain, part of it was collected and stored for broader use. This was not viewed as sudden extraction, but as part of the shared system that kept everything functioning. Grain moved from fields to storage, and from storage to distribution. The movement was steady and organized. Not constant change, but repeated flow. In this way, society functioned almost like the Nile itself. A cycle of gathering, storing, and redistributing. Work did not exist in isolation. It was connected through layers of organization that mirrored the natural cycles of the land. Even justice and rules followed a sense of consistency. Disputes were handled through known processes. Local leaders or officials would listen, evaluate, and respond according to established customs. The goal was not dramatic punishment or sudden change, but restoration of balance. To return things to their expected place. This idea of balance was central. It shaped how people thought about nearly everything. A stable society was one where each part stayed in its proper role. Not in a way that felt forced in everyday experience, but in a way that made the world feel understandable. A farmer knew farming. A scribe knew writing. A builder knew construction. And each of these roles existed alongside the others in a repeating structure. There was little expectation that a person's entire world would shift suddenly. Life moved forward through gradual continuation rather than abrupt transformation. Even movement between places followed familiar paths. People traveled along river routes or established roads between villages and towns. These routes were used repeatedly until they became part of memory itself. Travel was not random exploration in most cases. It was movement along known lines. And so even distance felt structured. The world was large, but not chaotic. It was arranged in a way that could be learned and remembered. This sense of order extended into architecture as well. Buildings were constructed with consistent methods. Homes, storage spaces, and public structures followed patterns that were familiar across regions. Materials like mud brick and stone were shaped in ways that supported stability and repeated use. Nothing about construction required constant reinvention. It was built on knowledge passed down and refined through repetition. Even in cities, where life might seem more complex, the same underlying rhythm remained. Markets operated in steady cycles. Goods arrived and were exchanged in predictable ways. People gathered, traded, and returned to their homes, all within familiar patterns of movement. There was activity, but it was structured activity. Not chaotic motion, but organized flow. In this way, society felt like a woven fabric. Each thread supported the others. And once woven, the pattern held its shape. What made Egyptian society feel so predictable was not the absence of change. It was the presence of systems that absorbed change and returned it to familiar form. The river rose, and the land adjusted. The harvest came, and storage organized it. Work shifted with seasons, but always returned to known cycles. Even when difficulties occurred, they were understood as variations within a larger pattern, not as complete disruption. This created a deep sense of continuity across generations. A child born into this world would grow up seeing the same fields, the same river, the same rhythms of work and rest. And so they would come to expect stability as a natural condition of life. Not something guaranteed in every detail, but something reliable in structure. As the day moved forward in ancient Egypt, this structure remained present in the background of everything. In the movement of officials along quiet paths. In the careful recording of grain and labor. In the steady flow of water through controlled channels. All of it connected. All of it repeating. All of it gently reinforcing the same simple idea. That life, in its many parts, could remain understandable when it followed patterns that did not need to change quickly. And within that understanding, society found its calm predictability. In ancient Egypt, food was not something that appeared suddenly or unexpectedly. It arrived through a long, steady chain of familiar actions. From river, to field, to storage, to home. Each step followed the one before it, in a rhythm that rarely changed. Bread was one of the most common foods, and it carried the feeling of daily life itself. Grain was gathered after harvest, stored carefully in large containers, and then brought out in measured amounts. At home, it was ground slowly into flour using simple stone tools. The motion was repetitive. A back and forth grinding, steady and practiced, like a quiet ritual that never needed to be rushed. The sound of grain turning into flour was soft and consistent. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the sound of something becoming something else through patience. Water was added. Dough was formed. Bread was shaped and placed into clay ovens heated by steady fire. The process did not change much from day to day. And because of that, it became part of the rhythm of life. Food preparation was not an interruption in the day. It was part of the day itself. Other foods followed similar patterns. Vegetables grown near the riverbanks. Fish taken from the Nile. Simple fruits gathered when available. Each of these came from systems that people understood well. Fishing followed the river's behavior. Farming followed the flood cycle. Gathering followed seasonal availability. Nothing was random in the way food appeared in daily life. It all came from known patterns of nature and labor. Meals themselves were often simple. Not because life lacked richness, but because repetition shaped expectation. People ate what was available in steady cycles. What was eaten one season would often appear again in the next. This familiarity gave food a sense of continuity. Not surprise. Not novelty. But reliability. Even the act of sharing food within families followed a quiet order. People gathered at similar times each day. They sat in familiar places. They used simple vessels that had been shaped for repeated use. Conversation during meals was calm. It often followed the same gentle patterns as other parts of life. Talk about work. Talk about the river. Talk about weather or small changes in daily routine. Nothing rushed. Nothing fragmented. Outside the home, food also moved through wider systems of exchange. Trade was not chaotic or unpredictable. It followed established routes along the Nile and between settlements. Boats carried goods slowly along the river. Their movement was guided by current and wind, but also by experience. People knew where to stop, where to trade, where to rest. These were not decisions made each time from scratch. They were patterns learned over years. Markets in villages and towns reflected the same sense of order. Stalls were set up in familiar places. Goods were displayed in steady arrangements. People arrived, exchanged items, and left without urgency. Trade was not separate from daily life. It was woven into it. A farmer might bring grain. A craftsman might bring pottery. A fisherman might bring dried fish. And each exchange followed known expectations. There was no need for constant negotiation of new systems. The system itself was already understood. Even value was shaped by repetition. People learned over time what certain goods were worth in relation to others. Not through abstract numbers, but through repeated experience. This grain equals that amount of cloth. This fish equals that measure of oil. These understandings were not fixed in rigid rules, but they were stable enough to guide daily exchange. Because of this, trade felt predictable. Not because nothing ever changed, but because change happened within familiar boundaries. The river played a central role in this stability. It acted as both a source of life and a path of connection. Boats moved along it in slow, steady motion. They did not rush. They followed the natural current, adjusting gently when needed. Travel along the river felt like part of the same rhythm that shaped farming and daily work. Movement was continuous, but never frantic. Even distant regions were connected through this same waterway. Goods, people, and information moved along predictable routes. And because of this, the wider world still felt structured and known. Food storage also contributed to this sense of stability. Granaries and storage rooms were not just practical buildings. They were the foundation of security. Inside them, grain and other supplies were kept in carefully measured amounts. Not for immediate use alone, but for future continuity. This meant that even when fields rested or floods disrupted access to land, food remained available. Life did not break. It adjusted. This system of storage reinforced the feeling that tomorrow would resemble today. Not in every detail, but in its essential needs. People would eat. People would work. People would continue. Even when certain seasons brought less abundance, the structure of storage and planning helped maintain balance. This created a calm sense of continuity across time. Food did not arrive in sudden bursts of uncertainty. It arrived through cycles that had already been prepared for. In homes, food preparation became one of the most familiar daily routines. The smell of bread baking. The sound of water being poured. The steady motion of grinding grain. These were not special events. They were ordinary parts of life that repeated so often they became almost invisible. And yet they shaped the rhythm of each day. Morning preparation. Midday rest. Evening meals. The structure remained consistent. Even tools used in food preparation followed the sense of repetition. Bowls, grinding stones, cooking vessels. Each item was designed for repeated use, not replacement or novelty. They were shaped to endure many cycles of daily life. And in that endurance, they became part of the predictable environment itself. Food, trade, and daily survival were not separate systems in ancient Egypt. They were interconnected parts of a single, steady rhythm. The river provided water and movement. The fields provided grain and cycles. The people provided labor and repetition. Together, they formed a system that rarely needed to change its basic shape. And because of this, daily life remained deeply predictable. Not in a dull or empty way, but in a way that allowed people to understand their place within it without constant uncertainty. As the day slowly moved forward, food was prepared, exchanged, and shared again. And in each small repetition, the larger pattern of life quietly continued, steady and familiar, like a river that never forgot its course. In ancient Egypt, even the passing of time beyond a single day felt familiar. Not because nothing changed, but because change followed a pattern that people had learned to trust. The year did not feel like a series of surprises. It felt like a circle slowly turning through known stages. The river rose. The land softened. The fields were planted. The harvest returned. And then, quietly, it began again. This rhythm shaped not only work and food, but also belief. People understood the world through cycles that repeated in both nature and human life. Even the gods were connected to patterns of return, renewal, and balance. This did not feel distant or abstract. It felt woven into the same fabric as daily living. Religious life in ancient Egypt was not separate from ordinary life. It moved alongside it. Temples stood as quiet centers of order, not far removed from villages and fields, but connected to them through shared rhythm. Inside these spaces, rituals followed carefully repeated actions. Movements were performed in the same sequence. Words were spoken in familiar forms. Offerings were made in steady, expected ways. There was no rush. Ritual was not about speed or intensity. It was about correctness through repetition. Each action had been done before. Each gesture had meaning through continuity. This created a sense of stability that extended beyond the physical world. People believed that when order was maintained in ritual, it supported order in nature itself. When things were performed correctly, the world continued to function as expected. The river would rise. The fields would grow. Life would continue. In this way, belief reinforced the same predictability that shaped farming, trade, and daily labor. Everything connected back to cycles. Even the idea of renewal was central. The sun rose each morning after disappearing at night. This simple pattern became a powerful symbol of return. Darkness was not an end. It was a pause before repetition. Light always came back. And because this happened every day, it became part of how people understood all forms of change. Nothing truly ended in a final way. It transformed, paused, and returned in another form. This understanding made time feel continuous rather than fragmented. Seasons followed a similar structure. The heat of the dry season was intense, but expected. The flood season brought water and change, but not surprise. The growing season allowed stability to return once more. Each phase had its place. Each phase led into the next. Even moments of difficulty were understood within this structure. If the flood was too strong or too weak, it was still part of the cycle. Adjustment was necessary, but the system itself remained intact. This created a deep sense of resilience within predictability. Life did not need to be perfect to feel stable. It only needed to continue following its pattern. Rituals in daily life reflected this same idea. Small practices marked transitions in the day. Morning preparation. Evening rest. Moments of offering or reflection within homes or local spaces. These actions were simple, but their repetition gave them meaning. They connected ordinary life to larger cycles of time. Even the act of honoring ancestors followed this sense of continuity. People remembered those who came before them not as distant figures, but as part of the ongoing flow of life. Names and memories were preserved through repetition in speech and ritual. This created a sense that the past was not gone. It remained present in subtle ways. Not as interruption, but as foundation. In temples, the presence of time felt especially slow and steady. Stone structures held rituals in place across generations. Walls, carvings, and spaces were designed not for change, but for endurance. The same ceremonies could take place in the same locations for long periods of time. This physical stability reinforced the idea that the world itself was stable. Even the movement of priests and attendants followed structured patterns. They entered spaces in specific ways. They performed tasks in known sequences. They maintained rhythm through repetition. Nothing about this process felt rushed or improvised. It was carefully preserved. Outside of temples, everyday people still felt the influence of this structured belief system. Not through constant participation, but through shared understanding. The world was ordered. Life followed cycles. Balance mattered. These ideas were not debated in daily life. They were lived quietly through habit and tradition. Even festivals, when they occurred, were not chaotic disruptions. They were timed according to seasonal cycles and agricultural rhythms. They marked moments within the year that were already known in advance. People gathered. Food was shared. Music and movement appeared in familiar forms. And then, just as gently, life returned to its regular rhythm. Work resumed. Fields were tended. Routines continued. The festival did not break predictability. It was part of it. In this way, even celebration followed structure. There was joy, but within a known frame. There was gathering, but within expected timing. Everything returned to its place afterward. This return was important, because it reinforced the sense that life always comes back to order. Even after variation, there is stability. Even after change, there is repetition. And as the year moved forward, this understanding deepened. People did not expect constant transformation. They expected continuity with gentle variation. The river would behave as it had before. The fields would respond as they had before. The rituals would continue as they had before. And life, in its many layers, would remain understandable. Not fully controlled. Not perfectly predictable in every detail. But stable in its overall rhythm. As the seasons turned once again, and the Nile continued its steady cycle of rising and falling, belief and daily life remained intertwined. Each reinforcing the other. Each returning to familiar shape. And in that quiet repetition, ancient Egyptian society maintained a sense of order that felt almost natural, as if the world itself preferred to move in patterns that could be known, remembered, and gently repeated. In ancient Egypt, one of the quietest truths of life was that nothing truly felt isolated. A single day was not separate from the next. A single life was not separate from those that came before or after. Everything existed inside a long, steady continuity. Like the Nile itself, always moving, but always returning. By the time a person reached the later stages of life, the patterns they had lived through no longer felt like something they had learned. They felt like something that had always been there. Morning light over the river. Fields waiting after the flood. Bread prepared in the same slow rhythm. Work returning in the same steady order. These were no longer steps in a system. They were simply life. Children became adults by slowly entering this same rhythm. There was no sudden moment when the structure of society revealed itself. It was already present from the beginning. A child watched water being carried. Watched grain being prepared. Watched fields being worked. And over time, these repeated images became understanding. Not through explanation, but through repetition so consistent it became memory. As generations passed, very little needed to be reinvented in daily life. Tools remained similar. Work remained similar. Routines remained similar. Even the landscape, shaped by the river, carried the same familiar presence. The Nile did not change its role in people's lives. It remained the center. A slow-moving force that defined where life could exist and how it would continue. Villages remained close to its banks. Fields remained aligned with its floods. Paths and routes continued to follow its direction. This closeness created a sense of stability that stretched across time. A person could look at the river and see not only their present life, but also the lives of those who had come before. And in that reflection, there was a feeling of continuity that was difficult to separate into individual moments. Even memory itself was shaped by repetition. Stories told within families did not change rapidly. They were repeated, reshaped slightly, then repeated again. Over time, they became familiar forms rather than new accounts. A story about a good harvest. A story about a strong flood. A story about a careful season of work. These were not dramatic turning points in a historical sense. They were reminders that the cycle had continued. And continuity, more than change, was what gave meaning to those stories. Even death, which might seem like an end, was understood within this same rhythm. It was not viewed as a sudden break from order. It was part of a larger pattern that extended beyond visible life. People were remembered. Names were spoken. Rituals were performed. Not as interruption, but as continuation in another form. This reinforced the idea that nothing fully disappeared from the cycle. It simply moved into a different place within it. As long as the living continued their roles, the structure remained intact. Work in the fields continued. Water from the river continued. Rituals continued. Trade continued. Each part supporting the others in a stable arrangement. Even when individual lives ended, the pattern itself did not shift. It remained steady. And so society felt predictable not just in the short term, but across generations. A child could look at the world and see the same structures that their parents had seen. And those parents had seen the same structures as their own parents. This long repetition created a sense that the world was not temporary or unstable, but enduring. Not perfect, but consistent. Even changes that did occur were absorbed into this larger rhythm. A new ruler. A variation in flood strength. A shift in local conditions. These were experienced, but they did not erase the underlying pattern. The river still rose. The fields still responded. Life still continued. In this way, change did not break predictability. It moved within it. As the day quietly ends in the imagined landscape of ancient Egypt, the same soft rhythms remain present. The river continues its slow movement. The fields rest after their cycles of work. Homes settle into evening stillness. Smoke from cooking fires drifts gently upward and disappears into the dimming sky. Light softens. Sound lowers. Movement slows. And everything returns, once again, to a familiar calm. Nothing feels sudden. Nothing feels uncertain. Just the steady continuation of patterns that have already been known. And as night settles over the river valley, there is a sense that tomorrow will not arrive as something unfamiliar. It will arrive as a return. The river will still be there. The fields will still wait. The work will still continue. And life, in its quiet and predictable rhythm, will gently begin again. In ancient Egypt, even the idea of a day felt less like a sharp division of time and more like a gradual unfolding. Nothing began suddenly. Nothing ended abruptly. Life moved in layers, as if each moment was gently placed on top of the previous one, forming a continuous surface that never needed to be rebuilt from scratch. When morning arrived over the Nile Valley, it did not feel like an event. It felt like a return of light that had already been expected. The sky slowly changed color, not in dramatic shifts, but in soft transitions. Darkness did not disappear all at once. It faded. And in that fading, the world became visible again. Homes were already familiar with this rhythm. Inside mud-brick houses, people did not wake to noise or urgency. They woke to temperature changes, to light moving across walls, to the quiet awareness that the day had already begun without needing announcement. There was a deep comfort in this lack of surprise. A person did not need to wonder what the morning would bring. They already knew its shape. Water would be fetched. Bread would be prepared. Animals would be guided. Fields would be checked. The order of actions rarely changed. Even if small variations existed, they stayed within the same familiar structure. This structure extended into the physical layout of villages. Homes were placed close together, not in scattered randomness, but in clustered patterns shaped by land, water, and long habit. Paths between houses were not formally designed, but they became fixed through repetition. Feet walked the same route so many times that the ground itself became part of memory. Dust, stone, and soil formed quiet records of movement. Over time, the village became something that almost guided its own inhabitants. Not through force, but through familiarity. A person did not think about where to walk. They simply walked. Even sound in these spaces followed predictable rhythms. The early morning carried soft movement. The midday carried slower activity. The evening carried quietness that spread across homes like a gentle covering. Nothing in this environment demanded constant attention. Everything had its place in time. Even labor, which might seem heavy or demanding from the outside, was deeply structured. A farmer did not approach the field as a space of uncertainty. The field was known. Its boundaries were known. Its behavior across seasons was known. The soil after the flood was known. The timing of planting was known. The rhythm of growth was known. This knowledge did not remove effort, but it removed confusion. Work became repetition guided by memory. And memory, in this environment, was shaped by cycles so consistent that forgetting was rare. People did not need to constantly relearn their world. They lived inside a world that reminded them of itself every year. The river rose. The river fell. The fields responded. The cycle continued. Even tools reflected this deep predictability. Objects used in daily life were not designed for novelty or variation. They were designed for repetition. A grinding stone was used in the same motion each day. A basket was carried in the same way across the same paths. A plow moved through soil in familiar lines. These objects did not change often because their purpose did not change often. They existed within stability. Even the body itself became part of this rhythm. Hands learned movement through repetition. Feet learned paths through familiarity. Muscles learned work through seasonal cycles. Over time, action became almost automatic. Not because it was forced, but because it was reinforced by endless return. Time in ancient Egypt was not experienced as fragmentation. It was experienced as accumulation. Each day added itself to the previous one without breaking the pattern. And this created a psychological atmosphere of continuity. A feeling that life was not a series of disconnected moments, but a long unfolding sequence. Even rest followed predictable timing. After labor, there was shade. After heat, there was cooling. After movement, there was stillness. Rest was not escape from life. It was part of its rhythm. The same rhythm that governed work also governed pause. and in that balance, nothing felt unstable. Even the landscape contributed to this feeling. The Nile did not change course in dramatic ways in the lived experience of most people. It remained a constant presence, shaping everything around it. Its movement was slow enough to feel eternal. Not urgent. Not chaotic. Just continuous. Fields aligned with its behavior. Villages aligned with its banks. Life aligned with its timing. Even distant horizons were predictable. The desert remained dry and still. The river valley remained fertile and active. Two contrasting environments, but both stable in their own way. One did not invade the other unexpectedly. They existed side by side in long-term balance. In this world, predictability was not seen as limitation. It was seen as structure that made survival possible. Without it, life would have felt unstable and uncertain. But with it, life could be organized, repeated, and understood. And as the day slowly moves forward again in this imagined ancient landscape, the same quiet pattern continues without interruption. Light rises. Work begins. Time unfolds. And the world remains gently, steadily known. In ancient Egypt, predictability was not only something built into the land or the river. It also slowly shaped the way people thought. Not through instruction alone, but through daily exposure to the same patterns, repeated so often that they became part of perception itself. A child growing up in a village along the Nile did not experience the world as something that needed to be constantly figured out. The world was already arranged in familiar ways. Morning always followed night. Water always came from the same direction. Fields always responded to the same seasons. Work always returned in the same order. And because of this, childhood itself unfolded inside a quiet structure of expectation. A young child would first become aware of sound. The low movement of people waking. The soft preparation of food. The distant movement of animals being guided outside. These sounds were not surprising. They were expected background rhythms. Even before understanding language fully, children absorbed the timing of life. They learned when people moved and when they rested. When homes were active and when they became quiet. This early awareness formed the foundation of how they understood the world. Not as unpredictable space, but as structured flow. As children grew older, they began to participate in small tasks. Not as sudden responsibility, but as gradual inclusion. Carrying water in small containers. Observing grain being prepared. Following adults to fields or storage spaces. Watching animals being tended with steady care. Each task was simple, but each repeated many times. And repetition, in this environment, was the primary way learning happened. There was little separation between watching and doing. A child watched until the action became familiar. Then slowly began to repeat it. And over time, repetition became instinct. Nothing about this process required urgency. There was no expectation of fast transformation. Growth was slow. Understanding was slow. Skill was slow. And because everything moved slowly, everything felt stable. Even mistakes were not treated as disruptions. They were part of the same repeating cycle. A misstep in grinding grain. A dropped container of water. A poorly shaped piece of bread. These were corrected through repetition, not through sudden change. Try again. Repeat again. Learn again. The world reinforced patience simply by never rushing. As children became more aware of the wider village, they began to notice patterns beyond the home. They saw that adults followed predictable routes each day. They saw that fields were worked in certain seasons. That boats moved along the river at familiar times. That storage areas filled and emptied in steady cycles. Even conversations between adults reflected this structure. Talk often returned to familiar topics. The river, the fields, the weather, the timing of work. There was comfort in this repetition. Not boredom in the modern sense, but recognition. A sense that life did not need to constantly introduce something new in order to feel complete. Children learned this without being told. They absorbed it by living inside it. And so, by the time they reached adulthood, the idea of unpredictability felt less like a normal condition of life and more like an exception. The expected world was one that repeated. This mindset extended into how people handled uncertainty. When something unusual happened, a shift in flood strength, a delay in harvest, a disruption in trade, it was not seen as collapse of order. It was seen as variation within order. The underlying structure remained trusted. The river would still return. The fields would still respond. The cycle would still continue. This belief was not abstract philosophy. It was practical experience repeated across generations. Even emotions followed this rhythm of predictability. Joy was tied to harvest, festivals, successful seasons. Calm was tied to routine, work, and repetition. Concern was tied to temporary disruptions, but rarely to permanent instability. People did not live in constant emotional fluctuation. Their emotional lives moved in cycles, just like the seasons. In the background of all of this, the Nile continued its slow shaping of time. The river did not rush. It did not pause. It rose and fell in long, patient intervals that structured everything around it. When the flood came, it did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as expected transformation. The land softened. The water spread. Movement shifted. And then, just as slowly, it receded, leaving behind soil that would once again support life. This repetition of transformation created a deep sense of trust in natural cycles. Even when water covered familiar paths, people did not interpret it as permanent disruption. They waited. Because waiting had always worked before. During flood periods, villages adjusted naturally. Some areas became temporarily inaccessible. Movement changed from walking to boating in certain places. Daily labor paused in fields but continued in homes. Inside homes, life did not stop. It simply shifted focus. Food preparation, repair work, tool maintenance, quiet conversation, rest. These activities filled the time without breaking structure. Even periods of stillness were not empty. They were part of the cycle. As floodwaters slowly withdrew, the land reappeared gradually. Not suddenly, but in stages. First edges. Then fields. Then full pathways. This slow return reinforced the sense that change itself was predictable in shape, even if not in exact timing. People did not need to guess what would happen. They only needed to recognize when it was happening. And recognition was easier than uncertainty. In this way, life in ancient Egypt was not just organized externally. It was internalized. The environment shaped thought until repetition became natural expectation. And expectation became calm. Even the idea of planning for the future was grounded in cycles rather than uncertainty. People planned for the next flood, for the next harvest, for the next season of work. Not for unpredictable disruption, but for known return. This created a long horizon of stability. A sense that life would continue in recognizable form. As the day slowly settles again in this imagined landscape, the same rhythm remains. Children learn through repetition. Adults live through repetition. The river continues its cycle. And society, shaped gently by all of it, moves forward in a way that feels less like change, and more like return. In ancient Egypt, life did not move in sudden emotional extremes. It moved slowly, in the same way the river moved steady, layered, and always returning to balance after change. People still felt happiness, concern, relief, or sadness. But these feelings rarely arrived as overwhelming shocks. They tended to fit inside the structure of daily life, like water fitting into a familiar channel. One of the quiet effects of living in a predictable world was that emotions themselves became more steady over time. Not weaker. Just less abrupt. A farmer did not wake each morning wondering if the world would suddenly transform. So the mind was not constantly preparing for disruption. Instead, attention stayed close to what was already known. The field that would be worked. The grain that would be stored. The water that would be carried. The people who would be seen again and again. Familiarity shaped emotional life. When something went well, when the flood came at the right level, or the harvest was good, it created a calm satisfaction. Not surprise in a sharp sense, but confirmation. The world had behaved as expected. And that expectation being met created a quiet form of relief. Even difficulties were experienced within this same emotional structure. If a flood was weaker than usual, or if work was harder in a given season, it was understood as a variation in a known cycle. Concern existed, but it did not usually expand into total uncertainty. Because the underlying system was still trusted. The river would return. The soil would be worked again. The cycle would continue. This trust shaped emotional stability. People did not carry constant tension about what might happen next. The future was not imagined as a blank space. It was imagined as a continuation of what had already been seen many times before. Even rest carried emotional steadiness. When the day ended and work slowed, there was no sense of abrupt separation from life. Evening was not an escape. It was a transition. The heat faded. The light softened. Movement slowed naturally. And people entered a quieter state that felt aligned with everything around them. Homes became still. Voices lowered. Thoughts settled. Not because of effort, but because the environment itself encouraged it. In this kind of rhythm, even boredom did not feel like emptiness in the modern sense. There was always something present. Sound. Routine. Repetition. Familiar movement. Time was filled, not fragmented. So the mind did not constantly seek novelty in the same way it might in faster changing environments. Instead, attention often rested on detail. The feel of grain between fingers. The sound of water pouring into a jar. The movement of light across a wall during the day. The slow rhythm of walking along a known path. Small things became noticeable because they repeated so often. And repetition allows observation. In relationships between people, predictability also played a quiet role. Families saw each other daily. Neighbors followed similar schedules. Work groups formed stable patterns of cooperation. People did not meet as strangers and disappear again constantly. They met repeatedly across time. This created familiarity that shaped social life. You did not need to constantly learn someone from the beginning. You already knew their patterns. How they worked. When they rested. Where they moved during the day. What role they held in the shared structure of life. Even disagreements, when they occurred, were often resolved within known methods. There was little need for dramatic rupture. Life had too many overlapping cycles to allow constant fragmentation. The river still needed tending. The fields still needed work. The storage still needed organization. So even conflict tended to be absorbed back into continuity. This did not mean harmony in a perfect sense. It meant that disruption rarely broke the larger rhythm. Another quiet aspect of this predictability was how it shaped patience. Because things unfolded slowly, people learned to wait without tension. Waiting for floodwaters to recede. Waiting for crops to grow. Waiting for seasons to shift. Waiting was not idle in the emotional sense. It was active participation in time. The world was doing what it always did, and people simply aligned themselves with it. This alignment reduced urgency. Not all urgency, of course, life still required effort and attention. But the feeling that everything needed immediate change was rare. Even the passing of years felt gradual. A person did not feel life divided into sharp, disconnected stages. Instead, life felt like continuous layering. Each year adding another repetition of the same structure. Another flood. Another harvest. Another cycle of work and rest. Over time, this created a deep internal sense of continuity. A person did not feel like they were stepping into unknown space each day. They felt like they were moving through a familiar landscape that had already been walked many times before. Even the mind itself, shaped by this environment, tended toward structured thought. Not constant questioning of every possibility, but recognition of patterns. If the river rises, then fields will change. If fields change, then planting will follow. If planting follows, then harvest will return. This chain of understanding reduced uncertainty in everyday thinking. And reduction of uncertainty leads to emotional steadiness. In this world, even time of night had its own emotional consistency. Darkness did not feel threatening in a sudden way. It felt expected. A pause in movement. A slowing of life. A shared rest across homes and villages. And in that shared rest, there was a quiet sense of unity. Everyone paused together. Everyone resumed together. The world did not scatter into unpredictability at night. It simply slowed. As this imagined ancient world settles again into evening, the same pattern continues without interruption. Emotions remain steady. Life remains familiar. The river continues its patient movement. And everything returns, gently, to the calm repetition that holds it all together. In ancient Egypt, life always seemed to know where it could go, and where it could not. This sense did not need to be explained. It was visible in the land itself. On one side, there was the river valley. Green. Narrow. Living. On the other side, there was the desert. Wide. Dry. Still. These two worlds met, but they did not merge. And because of that, people lived inside a clearly shaped space. A space that felt defined, predictable, and contained. The desert was always present in the background of life. Not as something distant, but as something close enough to be seen from many villages along the Nile. A person could stand near the fields and look outward and see where life slowly ended. The land would grow less green, less soft, less forgiving. And then it would become sand and stone. This boundary was not dramatic in movement. It was gradual. Like a fading thought. But it was always there. And because it was always there, it shaped how people understood stability. Life did not spread endlessly in every direction. It stayed within a known corridor. The river made that corridor possible. Without it, the land would have been very different. But with it, life became concentrated, repeated, and predictable. Villages formed along this narrow stretch of fertility. Not scattered randomly, but placed where water and soil allowed continuation. This clustering of life made patterns more visible. People saw the same fields every year. The same riverbanks. The same routes between home and work. Even travel outside the village did not usually lead into unknown worlds. It followed the river. Upstream. Downstream. Always within the same guiding line. This created a kind of natural structure to movement. You did not need to imagine endless directions. You moved along something already shaped. Even the desert itself reinforced this feeling of limits. It was not chaotic. It was still. Stillness can be its own form of order. The desert did not change quickly. It did not shift in ways that demanded daily attention. It simply remained. And in that remaining, it marked the edge of what was possible. People learned to respect that edge. Not through fear alone, but through understanding. Beyond the cultivated land, survival became difficult. So life remained close to the river. Close to the source. Close to the cycle. This closeness reinforced predictability. Because when people live near the same center of life, repetition naturally follows. Fields are reused. Paths are reused. Buildings are rebuilt in similar places. Even expansion, when it happened, tended to follow familiar lines. The river guided growth like a quiet map. Another layer of predictability came from how resources were understood. Everything essential came from known sources. Water from the Nile. Food from the fields. Materials from nearby land. There was little need for distant uncertainty in daily survival. This reduced the sense of unknown space in everyday thinking. Life felt close. Contained. Manageable in its structure. Even imagination, in such a world, often grew from what was already seen. Stories, beliefs, and explanations of the world often reflected cycles, returns, and continuity. Because that is what life itself demonstrated every day. The sun rose and returned. The river rose and returned. The fields died and returned. Return was everywhere. Even the desert, though harsh, contributed to this understanding. Because it did not change quickly, it reinforced the idea that stability was normal. Not everything in the world was active or shifting. Some things simply existed as they were. And this contrast made the rhythm of the river valley feel even more structured. Within the narrow fertile land, movement was constant but organized. Outside it, stillness stretched wide and uninterrupted. Together, they formed a balanced environment. One side supporting life. The other defining its limit. In daily experience, this meant people always lived with a quiet awareness of boundaries. Not boundaries that restricted thought, but boundaries that shaped expectation. A farmer did not expect the desert to become farmland overnight. A villager did not expect the river to change direction suddenly. A craftsman did not expect materials to appear without cycle or effort. Instead, everything fit within known conditions. This reinforced a deeper emotional calm. Because when the world has clear edges, it is easier to understand. Uncertainty decreases when structure is visible. And in ancient Egypt, structure was visible everywhere. In land. In water. In work. In settlement. Even the sky, moving in steady cycles of sun and night, reflected this pattern of return and rhythm. As the day softens again in this slow unfolding narrative, the desert remains still in the distance. The river continues its measured flow. And life, held between them, continues in its familiar and predictable shape. Not rushing. Not breaking. Just repeating, gently, as it always has. In ancient Egypt, the Nile was not only water moving through land. It was memory made visible. Not in the way people today think of memory as stored thoughts or written records, but in a slower, deeper sense. A repetition of the same events so consistent that the land itself seemed to remember them. Each year, the river rose again. Each year, it touched the same fields. Each year, it withdrew, leaving behind soil that had already known this cycle many times before. And because this happened again and again, the river felt less like an event and more like a certainty. Something that did not need to be questioned. Only awaited. People did not wake up wondering if the flood would come. They lived with the understanding that it would. This understanding shaped everything. Even the way time was felt in the body. There was no sharp separation between past, present, and future in the way modern thinking often divides time. Instead, there was a sense of layered continuity. What happened before would happen again. What was seen before would be seen again. What was learned before would be used again. Time did not erase itself. It repeated itself in slow variation. And the river was the clearest expression of this. Its movement was steady enough to feel permanent, yet alive enough to change the land in visible ways. It was always the same river, yet never exactly the same moment. This balance created a kind of quiet trust. Not emotional excitement, but stable expectation. Even when the river behaved slightly differently, rising a little higher or a little lower than usual, it still remained within the known pattern. There was variation, but not disruption. This is one of the quiet reasons Egyptian society felt so predictable. It was not because nothing ever changed. It was because change always stayed inside familiar boundaries. The land itself supported the sense of memory. Soil carried the imprint of previous floods. Fields followed old lines of cultivation. Paths formed where people had walked for generations. Even without written records, the landscape held a kind of physical remembering. A memory that did not fade quickly. Villages were built in places that had already proven themselves livable. Near water. Near fertile soil. Near established routes. Once a place worked, it was used again. And again. This repetition created deep continuity between generations. A child would grow up standing in the same fields where their parents once stood. They would walk the same paths. See the same riverbanks. Work the same soil. Even if the people changed, the setting remained stable. And that stability shaped perception. The world felt like something that continued itself. Not something that needed constant rebuilding or reinterpretation. Even silence played a role in this feeling. The Nile Valley had long stretches of quiet. Not empty silence, but living silence. The sound of water moving slowly. The distant movement of wind across fields. The soft activity of life spread across wide space. This quietness made repetition more noticeable. When things are loud and chaotic, patterns are harder to feel. But when life is steady, even small repetitions become clear. The sound of footsteps on the same path. The same daily return of work. The same seasonal changes in light and heat. All of it became more visible in its simplicity. Over time, people did not just live in this rhythm. They internalized it. The mind began to expect repetition. Not consciously, but naturally. A kind of quiet prediction formed from experience. If the river rose last year, it will rise again. If the field grew then, it will grow again. If the cycle continued then, it will continue again. This way of thinking reduced uncertainty in daily life. Not by removing difficulty, but by framing it inside expectation. Even hardship, when it came, was often understood as part of a cycle. A difficult flood. A lighter harvest. A delayed season. These were variations in a known structure, not signs of collapse. This allowed society to remain emotionally and practically stable. People adapted, but they did not lose the sense of continuity. And continuity is one of the strongest foundations of predictability. The river also connected distant regions along its path. Not through sudden movement, but through steady flow. Goods traveled slowly. People moved gradually. Ideas spread through repetition and exchange. Everything followed the same natural direction. Upstream. Downstream. Always along the same line of water. This linear structure reinforced the sense that the world itself was organized in a readable way. There were not endless directions of expansion in everyday life. There was a central axis. And life moved along it. Even when people did not travel far, they still understood that their world was connected through the single guiding presence. The Nile was not just geography. It was structure. It was continuity. It was the quiet framework that held society in place. And because it repeated its behavior so consistently, it shaped not only agriculture or trade, but thought itself. A world that repeats teaches the mind to expect repetition. A world that returns teaches the mind to expect return. And so, slowly, deeply, ancient Egyptian society became one where predictability was not enforced. It was absorbed. As the day gently fades again in this long, slow unfolding of history, the river continues its patient movement through the land. The fields rest in their cycles. And the memory of repetition remains, quiet and steady, like something the world has always known how to do. In ancient Egypt, work rarely arrived as something new or unexpected. It arrived as continuation. A morning did not begin with the question of what might happen, but with the quiet recognition of what always happened. The same paths. The same tools. The same rhythms of effort that had already been lived many times before. This gave labor a certain calm structure. Not because it was easy, but because it was known. A farmer stepping into a field did not meet uncertainty in the way the soil would respond. The soil had already responded before. Many times. The river had already passed through it. The sun had already dried it. The seeds had already grown in it. So the work was not exploration. It was repetition guided by memory. Hence learned motion through seasons of repetition. Pulling. Placing. Cutting. Gathering. These actions became so familiar that over time they required less conscious thought. Not because attention disappeared, but because the pattern was already understood. Even the body began to anticipate the rhythm of work. Morning energy. Midday slowing. Evening rest. This bodily rhythm aligned with the rhythm of the land. And when body and land move in similar cycles, work becomes predictable in its feeling as well as its structure. Craft work followed the same calm logic. A potter shaping clay did not reinvent the process each time. The wheel turned. The hands guided. The shape slowly formed. Again and again. Small differences existed, but within a stable frame. A craftsman did not expect radical change in material behavior. Clay softened with water. Heat hardened it. Fire completed it. These were consistent relationships between elements. So work became a dialogue with known forces rather than a confrontation with unknown ones. Even construction followed long-established patterns. Stone placed upon stone. Mud brick shaped and dried in the sun. Structures built for function and endurance rather than constant redesign. Buildings did not need to change frequently because the needs they served did not change frequently. Shelter. Storage. Gathering space. Workspace. These remained consistent across generations. And because needs remained consistent, forms remained consistent. In this way, even architecture participated in predictability. Trade work moved along similar lines of repetition. Merchants and travelers followed known routes along the river. Stops were familiar. Connections were repeated. Exchanges followed expected patterns. There was little sense of exploring unknown systems in daily commerce. Instead, there was maintenance of established flow. Goods moved from one stable point to another, and then returned again in different forms. Even time spent traveling did not feel like disruption. It felt like extension of the same world. Because the river made travel continuous rather than fragmented. As the river itself moved through land in a steady direction, so did people and goods move along it. This alignment between natural movement and human movement reinforced predictability at every level. Even labor organization followed steady rhythm. Tasks were distributed according to known roles. People did not constantly shift between unfamiliar responsibilities. They returned to what they already understood. And repetition of role created clarity. A person did not need to wonder daily about their place in the system. Their place was already known through experience. This does not mean life was simple in a shallow way. The work itself could be demanding. Heat, physical effort, long hours in fields or workshops, all of this required endurance. But within that endurance, there was structure. And structure reduces uncertainty. Even when effort is heavy, familiarity makes it bearable in a different way. There is less mental strain when the shape of the day is known. In contrast, unpredictability often creates tension. But in this world, unpredictability was rare in daily labor. Most variations were seasonal or environmental, not structural. So people adjusted within known limits. This is part of why society could remain so stable over long periods. Not because nothing challenged it, but because challenges were understood as part of repeating cycles. Floods varied. Harvests varied. Conditions shifted slightly. But the system remained recognizable. Work did not collapse into disorder when variation occurred. It absorbed variation and returned to form. Over time, this created a shared cultural understanding. That effort leads to outcome in predictable ways. That seasons return. That labor returns. That structure returns. Even when individual days felt tiring, there was comfort in knowing the larger pattern would continue. The next day would resemble the previous one. The next season would resemble the last. The next cycle would resemble the one before it. And in this continuity, life gained a quiet stability that shaped everything beneath the surface. As evening settles again in this slow unfolding world, tools are set aside in familiar places, fields grow still, and movement fades gently into rest. And once more, the rhythm holds steady, repeated, and quietly predictable. In ancient Egypt, time did not feel like a line pulling people forward into something unknown. It felt more like a wide circle slowly turning, returning to places that were already familiar. Morning was not a new invention of the day. It was a return of light that had been there many times before. Night was not an ending in a final sense. It was a pause before the same return. This circular feeling of time shaped how everything else was understood. Work, seasons, growth, rest. All of it moved in patterns that repeated often enough to become natural expectation. Even the river, always present, reinforced this idea of return. Each flood was not treated as a separate, isolated event. It was part of a sequence that had already been seen before. The land would rise with water. The water would withdraw. The soil would appear again. And then the cycle would begin again. Because this happened so many times, people did not think of time as something unpredictable in its basic structure. They thought of it as something reliable in its pattern. Even when small differences appeared from year to year, they did not break the overall shape. Variation existed, but it stayed inside the known cycle. This gave life a sense of gentle repetition that extended far beyond agriculture. Even daily habits reflected this structure of return. People woke in similar ways, moved through similar tasks, rested at similar times. The day itself became a smaller version of the larger yearly cycle. Morning rising like flood. Midday like full expansion. Evening like retreat. Night like pause. Then return again. This layering of cycles created a feeling that time was not something passing away, but something continuously folding back onto itself. Even memory worked within this pattern. People remembered events not as isolated moments, but as part of repeating sequences. A good harvest was remembered as part of many good harvests. A difficult season was remembered as part of many difficult variations. A calm year was remembered as part of long stretches of calm years. This made personal memory feel connected to collective experience. No single life stood completely separate from the rhythm of the land. Instead, each life echoed patterns that had already existed before. Children grew up hearing these patterns repeatedly. Stories told by elders often followed similar structures. The river rose. The fields were planted. The harvest came. The cycle continued. Different words, but the same underlying rhythm. And through repetition, understanding formed naturally. The world behaves in cycles. The cycles return. Life continues inside them. Even emotional expectations were shaped by this circular time. People did not expect constant novelty. They expected return with variation. A familiar season with slight differences. A familiar task with small changes. A familiar year unfolding again with subtle shifts. This created a mental environment where surprise was rare in structure, even if it appeared in detail. And because structure remained stable, people could focus more on the rhythm of living than on constant uncertainty. Even architecture reflected the idea of cyclical time. Buildings were repaired, reused, and maintained rather than constantly replaced or redesigned. A structure could serve many generations while keeping its form. This continuity reinforced the sense that time was not erasing the world, but preserving it through repetition. Even materials carried this feeling. Mud brick returned to earth over time. Stone remained for long cycles. Wood changed slowly with seasons. Nothing existed outside time's gentle return to material cycles. In the same way, society itself followed cycles of organization. Work seasons. Flood seasons. Rest seasons. These were not interruptions to life. They were life itself unfolding in stages. Even when people moved through different roles or tasks, they often returned to familiar patterns later. Change existed, but it did not erase continuity. It folded into it. This is one of the quiet reasons ancient Egyptian society could feel so predictable across long periods. Not because everything stayed identical, but because everything stayed cyclical. And cycles, by their nature, reduce the feeling of surprise. They replace it with expectation. Not rigid expectation of exact repetition, but of familiar structure. And in that structure, life becomes easier to read. The river will rise. The fields will respond. The people will work. The cycle will continue. As the day slowly settles once again into quiet stillness in this unfolding world, time itself feels less like something moving forward and more like something gently turning back into itself. And in that turning, everything remains softly, steadily known. In ancient Egypt, people did not move through life surrounded by strangers. They moved within circles of familiarity. The same faces appeared each day. The same voices returned in the same places. The same relationships continued across seasons and years. This repetition shaped how people connected with one another. A relationship was not something formed quickly and then replaced. It was something that grew slowly through repeated contact. Neighbors saw each other in the morning as work began. They crossed paths along the same narrow routes. They worked beside each other in fields or shared tools and space. These encounters were not planned in a formal way. They simply happened because life followed predictable patterns. And because they happened again and again, familiarity deepened without effort. Even within families, relationships followed steady rhythms. Parents guided children through repeated actions. Children learned by watching and joining in. Generations lived close enough that memory and habit passed naturally between them. There was little separation between personal life and shared life. The same people were present in both. This created a sense of continuity in social experience. A person did not need to constantly adjust to new environments or unfamiliar groups. They lived within a stable network of known individuals. Even communication reflected this predictability. People spoke in ways shaped by shared understanding. There was less need for explanation of basic things. Everyone already knew the structure of daily life. They knew when work began. They knew how the river behaved. They knew what each season required. This shared knowledge made conversation smoother and quieter. Words did not need to carry everything. Much of understanding already existed beneath them. Even silence between people was comfortable. It did not feel empty. It felt understood. Two people could sit together without speaking much, and the rhythm of their shared life would still connect them. This kind of social environment reduces uncertainty. You do not wonder how others will behave each day. You already know. Their routines mirror your own. Their movements align with the same cycles. Their expectations match the structure you share. This creates a quiet form of trust. Not dramatic or emotional in an intense way, but steady, reliable, predictable. Even roles within the community were clear. A farmer worked the land. A craftsman shaped materials. A scribe recorded information. An official organized resources. These roles were not constantly shifting. They were maintained through repetition and learning. This clarity reduced confusion in social interaction. You knew what others did. You knew how they contributed. You knew where they fit within the larger pattern. This did not mean society was rigid in a harsh sense. It meant that structure provided orientation. A person could move through life without needing to constantly redefine their place. That place was already known. Even gatherings followed predictable patterns. People came together at certain times for shared work, for exchange, or for simple presence. These gatherings were not chaotic. They followed familiar timing and structure. People knew when they would occur. They knew who would be there. They knew what would happen. This predictability made social life calm rather than overwhelming. There was no constant adjustment to new situations. Instead, there was deepening familiarity within existing ones. Even disagreements, when they appeared, were handled within this structure. Because relationships were long-term and repeated, conflict could not easily be avoided or ignored. It had to be absorbed and resolved. Not always perfectly, but within known methods. People continued to see each other after disagreement. They continued to work alongside one another. The shared rhythm of life required continuation. And so, conflict rarely shattered the social structure. It was drawn back into it over time. This is another quiet form of predictability. Not the absence of conflict, but the expectation that life continues beyond it. Even emotional bonds were shaped by repetition. Affection, care, and connection grew slowly through daily presence. Not through sudden moments alone, but through countless small interactions. Sharing meals. Working side by side. Resting in the same spaces. These repeated experiences created depth without needing dramatic expression. Relationships felt stable because they were reinforced constantly. Not built once, but maintained through daily life. Even the rhythm of absence and return followed patterns. People left for work and returned at expected times. Travelers moved along known routes and came back along those same routes. Absence was not permanent or uncertain in most cases. It was part of a known cycle. Leave. Move. Return. This reinforced trust in continuity. As the day once again moves toward evening in this slow and steady world, social life softens with it. People return to their homes. Voices lower. Movement slows. But the connections remain. Not because they need to be recreated each day, but because they are already established. Already understood. Already part of the repeating pattern. And within that pattern, relationships, like everything else in ancient Egypt, continue quietly, predictably, and without sudden change. In ancient Egypt, order did not feel distant or abstract. It was present in small, quiet ways that people encountered throughout their daily lives. Not through constant command or visible force, but through structure that remained consistent over time. Authority existed, but it did not always appear as something sudden or disruptive. Instead, it moved gently through systems that people already understood. Local leaders, scribes, and officials were part of this structure. They did not arrive each day to change the shape of life. They helped maintain it. Records were kept. Resources were measured. Work was organized according to familiar patterns. These actions were not new inventions. They were repetitions of systems that had already proven stable. And because they repeated, they became expected. A farmer did not wonder whether grain would be measured after harvest. It always was. A worker did not question whether tasks would be organized. They always were. This predictability reduced uncertainty. Even when authority was present, it did not feel like interruption. It felt like continuation. Above local organization, there was a broader sense of guidance that extended through the idea of leadership itself. The pharaoh, though not part of everyday village life in a visible sense, represented continuity at the highest level. Not constant action, but constant presence. A symbol of order that remained stable even as individuals changed. People did not experience leadership as a daily disruption of routine. They experienced it as a steady backdrop to the system they lived within. Like the river, not always in direct focus, but always shaping the environment. This created a feeling that the world was guided. Not in a way that required constant attention, but in a way that reassured people that structure existed beyond their immediate view. Even large-scale organization, such as irrigation systems, reflected this quiet authority. Water was directed through channels that had been planned and maintained over time. These channels did not change shape randomly. They followed established paths. Fields received water according to patterns that had been used before. And because the system worked repeatedly, it became trusted. People did not need to constantly question whether water would reach their land. They knew how the system behaved. Even when adjustments were needed, they occurred within the same framework. Nothing was built from nothing each time. Everything was built from what already existed. This is one of the deeper layers of predictability in Egyptian society. Not only did daily life repeat, but the systems that supported it also repeated. Administration, labor organization, resource management all followed familiar forms. This continuity reduced the need for constant adaptation. People did not need to relearn how society functioned each generation. They inherited a system that already worked. And they continued it. Even justice followed this pattern of steady structure. When disagreements or disputes arose, they were addressed through known methods. Local authorities listened, considered, and responded within established customs. The goal was not sudden change. It was restoration of balance. To return things to their proper place within the system. This idea of balance appeared again and again. In land, in water, in work, and in social life. Authority existed to maintain that balance, not to disrupt it. Even large collective efforts, such as construction or seasonal labor projects, were organized in predictable ways. Groups formed. Tasks were assigned. Work proceeded in steady stages. There was coordination, but not chaos. Each person understood their role within the larger effort. And because roles were familiar, coordination required less explanation. Even the passage of authority from one generation to the next followed patterns. Leadership changed, but the structure remained. This continuity reinforced the idea that society itself was stable, even when individuals within it were not. A ruler might change. An official might change. But the system continued. And for most people, this continuity mattered more than individual change. Daily life remained recognizable. Fields were still worked. Water still flowed. Food was still prepared. Families still lived within the same rhythms. This is how predictability extended beyond individual experience into the structure of society as a whole. Not through rigid control, but through repeated systems that continued over time. As the day slowly fades once more in this quiet world, authority does not disappear. It simply becomes less visible. Like the river at night. Still present. Still shaping everything. But moving quietly in the background. And life, supported by this steady structure, continues in its familiar and predictable way. In ancient Egypt, not everything was defined by movement. In many ways, life was shaped just as much by stillness. Not emptiness, but a kind of quiet presence that existed between actions. A pause that was not separate from life, but part of its rhythm. During the heat of the day, when the sun stood high and the air grew heavy, movement slowed naturally. People did not force themselves to continue at the same pace. They adjusted. Work softened. Steps became slower. Voices lowered. Shade became important. Under simple coverings or near walls that held back the sun, people rested. Not in a rushed or temporary way, but in a calm acceptance that this part of the day belonged to stillness. There was no sense of wasting time. Time was not something that needed to be filled constantly. It was something that unfolded on its own. In this slower part of the day, small sounds became more noticeable. The quiet shifting of fabric. The soft movement of someone adjusting their position. The distant sound of water or wind moving gently across the land. These sounds were not interruptions. They were part of the environment. And because the world was not filled with constant noise, they could be heard clearly. Even breathing felt more present. A steady rhythm inside the body, matching the steady rhythm outside it. This kind of stillness shaped the mind. When life moves slowly, thoughts tend to follow. There is less urgency to jump from one idea to another. Less pressure to respond quickly. Instead, there is space for thoughts to settle. To repeat. To return. In this environment, even attention becomes calmer. A person might sit and watch the light shift slightly across a wall. Or notice the gradual movement of shadow along the ground. Or feel the slow cooling of air as the day begins to move toward evening. These small changes carried meaning because they were part of a larger, predictable pattern. The day was not rushing forward. It was unfolding. Even animals reflected this pace. During the hottest hours, they rested as well. Movement reduced across the entire landscape. Humans, animals, and environment all aligned in a shared rhythm of slowing. This alignment reinforced predictability. Everything followed similar timing. Everything responded to the same conditions. And because of this, life felt synchronized. Not fragmented. Even when activity resumed later in the day, it did so gradually. There was no sudden return to urgency. People rose slowly from rest. Movement increased step by step. Work continued, but with the same steady rhythm as before. Evening approached in the same gentle way. Light softened. Heat faded. Sound shifted. The environment signaled transition without sharp change. And people followed. Returning to homes. Preparing food. Settling into quieter spaces. The predictability of these transitions created comfort. Not because they were exciting, but because they were known. Even night, which might feel uncertain in other contexts, was part of this same calm rhythm. Darkness arrived slowly. Stars appeared gradually. The sky changed without sudden break. People did not experience night as something unpredictable. They had seen it many times before. It followed the same path each day. This repetition removed fear from darkness. It became familiar. Expected. A time for rest rather than uncertainty. Inside homes, the quiet deepened. Voices became softer. Movement reduced. The day gently came to an end. And within that ending, there was no sense of finality. Only pause. Because morning would return. It always did. In this world, stillness was not separate from activity. It was woven into it. Work and rest were not opposites. They were parts of the same cycle. Movement and pause. Sound and quiet. Light and darkness. Each leading into the other in predictable ways. And this balance created a life that felt stable not only in structure, but in experience. A life where even silence had a place. Even stillness had meaning. Even time itself seemed to breathe slowly, without hurry. As this quiet day settles once more into night, the rhythm continues. Unbroken. Unrushed. Gently repeating. And in that repetition, life remains calm, steady, and deeply predictable. In ancient Egypt, life was not only experienced day by day. It was also felt across long stretches of time, where generations moved through the same patterns without breaking them. A person did not stand alone in their moment. They stood within a quiet line of continuity. Parents had lived in similar ways. Grandparents had followed the same rhythms. Children would grow into those same patterns again. This continuity was not forced. It happened naturally, because the structure of life did not demand constant change. The river remained where it was. The land remained shaped by its floods. Work remained tied to the same cycles. And so, each generation inherited not only land and tools, but a way of living that already made sense. A young person did not need to imagine an entirely new path. They stepped into one that had already been walked many times before. This created a feeling of stability that stretched beyond individual experience. Life was not fragile in the sense of needing constant reinvention. It was durable, able to continue through repetition. Even homes reflected this endurance. Mud brick structures were repaired rather than abandoned. Walls were reshaped. Roofs were rebuilt. Spaces were reused. A home did not need to be entirely new to be useful. It simply needed to continue. And in that continuation, it carried memory. The same walls that held one generation would hold another. The same spaces would witness repeated cycles of daily life. This gave the physical environment a sense of familiarity across time. Even tools carried this feeling. A grinding stone could be used for many years. A basket could serve through countless cycles of work. Objects were not quickly replaced. They endured. And because they endured, they became part of the predictable structure of life. Even knowledge moved slowly across generations. Skills were not learned once and forgotten. They were practiced again and again. Passed from hand to hand. From observation to repetition. A child learned by watching. An adult refined by doing. An elder remembered through experience. This slow transmission of knowledge created continuity without disruption. There was no need for sudden shifts in understanding. Everything grew gradually. Even change, when it occurred, tended to be absorbed into existing patterns. A new tool might appear. A slightly different method might develop. But these changes did not erase what came before. They layered onto it. This layering is important. It means that time did not replace the past. It built upon it. Each generation added small adjustments, but the overall structure remained. This created a deep sense of endurance. Not permanence in a rigid sense, but stability through continuity. Even the landscape carried this feeling. Fields were cultivated year after year. Their boundaries remained familiar. Their behavior across seasons remained understood. Paths remained where people had walked. Riverbanks shifted slightly over time, but within a known range. Nothing transformed so suddenly that it erased recognition. And recognition is central to predictability. When you can recognize your world, you can trust it. Even the passage of life itself followed this pattern. A child grew slowly into adulthood. Adulthood carried the same responsibilities that had been seen before. Old age brought a quieter role, shaped by memory and observation. These stages were not sharply divided. They blended into one another, just as days blended into seasons. Life was not a series of abrupt changes. It was a gradual unfolding. and because of that, it felt continuous. Even death, which might seem like the greatest break, was understood within this same framework. It did not remove a person from the pattern entirely. It shifted their place within it. The living continued the work. The living continued the routines. The living continued the memory. And so the structure remained intact. Society did not reset with each generation. It continued. This continuation is one of the quiet reasons Egyptian society felt so stable over long periods. It was not dependent on constant innovation. It was supported by repetition that worked. When something works reliably, there is little need to replace it quickly. And so the system endured. As time moved forward, slowly and steadily, each generation added its presence to the same ongoing rhythm. Not breaking it, not rushing it, simply continuing it. As evening once again settles over the Nile Valley in this slow, imagined moment, the same patterns remain. Families gather. Homes grow quiet. The river flows. And somewhere within that stillness, the memory of countless generations rests gently, carried forward not in sudden change, but in calm and steady repetition. And so, the rhythm continues. Not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that quietly remains. In ancient Egypt, life did not build toward a sharp conclusion. It did not move toward a final moment where everything changed at once. Instead, it moved in circles. Soft circles. Slow circles. Circles that returned again and again to the same familiar places. The river still flows. Even now, in this quiet telling, it moves without urgency. Water passing over land that has known this movement for a very long time. Fields still wait for their season. The soil, dark and patient, holds the memory of many cycles. It does not rush to grow. It waits, as it always has. Homes, built from earth, hold the warmth of the day. Inside, life continues in small, steady ways. A quiet preparation. A familiar motion. A repeated act that does not need to be explained. People rest as evening deepens. Not because the day has ended completely, but because it has reached its natural pause. The same pause that comes each night. The same pause that has come for countless nights before. Voices soften. Movement slows. The world becomes still, but not empty. There is always something present. The sound of distant water. The quiet shifting of air. The slow rhythm of breathing. Even the sky follows its pattern. Stars appear where they have appeared before. They do not rush into place. They return. And in their return, they remind the world that nothing here is sudden. Nothing is truly lost. Everything moves, and then moves again. In this kind of life, predictability is not something that restricts. It is something that supports. It allows people to live without constant uncertainty. To wake without fear of the unknown. To rest knowing that tomorrow will arrive in a form that can be understood. This does not remove difficulty. It does not make every season perfect. But it creates a structure where life can continue, even through variation. The river may rise higher one year, lower the next. The harvest may be abundant or modest. But the cycle remains. And because the cycle remains, life remains. This is the quiet foundation of Egyptian society. Not sudden brilliance. Not constant change. But steady repetition. A world where patterns are trusted because they have always returned. As night settles more deeply over the land, the river continues its slow movement. Fields rest in darkness. Homes hold quiet life within their walls. And everything seems to pause, just enough to breathe. There is no final ending here. Only a gentle fading into stillness. Because in a world shaped by cycles, endings are never complete. They are only moments between repetitions. Moments where the world becomes quiet before beginning again. And so, without urgency, without conclusion, the rhythm continues. Softly. Steadily. As it always has.